There are places in this world that never truly died. They simply fell into a long, quiet sleep, wrapped in dust and memory, waiting to be remembered. Close your eyes, if you'd like. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts settle, like ash drifting gently to the ground. Imagine for a moment, walking through narrow streets paved with sun-warmed stone, where the walls still hold the warmth of the day, and the air carries the faint scent of salt, wild herbs, and baking bread. Vines climb over crumbling archways, and fountains that haven't flowed in centuries still whisper in the wind, as if remembering their song. This is not a dead city. It is one that stopped breathing, but never stopped dreaming. Welcome, wherever you are listening from, beneath the glow of a nightlight, curled beneath soft blankets, or perhaps lying awake while rain taps gently on your window. You are not alone. We are about to journey together, not through time as a historian might, but as a dreamer would, slowly, gently, with attention to the small things. The way light falls across a courtyard at dawn, the sound of footsteps fading down an alley, the weight of a hand on a door that was never closed again. This is the story of Pompeii, not the version you saw in that grand film where the hero rides a horse through a volcanic eruption, like it's just another Tuesday. You know the one. The man who dodges falling boulders, outruns rivers of ash, and somehow keeps his dignity and his hair perfectly intact. Jon Snow may have known nothing, but in that movie, he clearly knew how to survive the end of the world. But this is not that story. This is not about heroes on horses or last-second escapes. This is about the people who didn't run, the ones who stayed, who waited, who held their children close, who looked up at the darkening sky with confusion, not cinematic certainty. This is the story of ordinary lives, of bakers who rose before dawn, of mothers who combed their children's hair, of slaves who swept mosaics they weren't allowed to own, of lovers who whispered promises in garden alcoves. People who woke up on an August morning like any other, unaware that their city was about to become a frozen moment, preserved not in gold or marble, but in ash and silence. And yet, in that silence, so much remains. Not just ruins, not just artifacts behind glass, but echoes. A child's sandal left by the door. A dog curled in the corner of a shop, frozen in its final moment of waiting. A man clutching a small pouch of coins, as if money still mattered when the sky turned black. These are not relics. They are remnants of breath, of heartbeat, of love. And when we walk through Pompeii today, we don't just see the past, we feel its pulse. If this stirs something in you, a memory, a question, a feeling, I'd love to hear it. You don't need to share your name. Just a sentence, a word even, something you'd want to leave behind if time suddenly paused around you. Leave it in the comments whenever you feel ready. Because in a way, that's what Pompeii teaches us. That the smallest things, a gesture, a glance, a note left unfinished, are often the ones that last the longest. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this little corner of calm, perhaps now is the perfect moment. Because every week, we return to places like this, cities buried, voices silenced, moments lost, not to mourn, but to remember softly, to breathe life back into what was forgotten, and to drift together into stories that feel less like history and more like dreams. But before we feel the first tremor beneath the streets, before the sky darkens and the wind changes, we must begin where all stories do, not with destruction, but with life, with the ordinary, with the everyday, with the kind of morning that happens 1,000 times, unnoticed, until it becomes the last one. So let us step gently into that morning, into a world that still believed in tomorrow, into a city that, for just a little while longer, lived in peace, in warmth, in the quiet rhythm of ordinary things. Because before the mountains stirred, before the earth trembled, before the air grew thick with smoke and fear, there was a day like any other. A day of bread and laughter, of chores and sunlight, of children playing between columns and fishermen mending their nets by the shore. And it is there, in that fragile, golden calm, that our story begins. The light of early morning spreads across the Bay of Naples with a gentle, unhurried glow, softening the edges of rooftops and warming the terracotta tiles that cover homes both modest and grand. It slips through open doorways and latticed windows, falling across mosaic floors where thousands of tiny stones form images of dolphins leaping through waves, of grapes heavy on the vine, of God smiling with quiet wisdom. In courtyards enclosed by colonnades, fountains trickle with a sound so faint it blends into the air itself, like the breath of the city. A cat stretches in a patch of sunlight near a stone bench, its paws extending slowly before it settles again, eyes half closed, as if even it knows this day holds no urgency. The air carries the scent of damp earth from last night's dew, of salt from the distant sea, and of wild thyme growing between the cracks in the stone paths. This is not a moment preserved for history, not a scene staged for memory. This is life as it unfolds in its most ordinary form, steady, warm, and unaware that it is living its final hours. The narrow streets of Pompeii wind like threads through a tapestry, their cobblestones worn smooth by generations of footsteps, cartwheels, and bare feet running to and fro. Some stones are cracked, others slick with moisture, reflecting the pale blue of the sky like small, scattered pools. Between the 2- and 3-story homes, laundry hangs from ropes strung between balconies, linen tunics and woolen cloaks swaying gently in the breeze that rolls in from the coast, carrying with it the faint cry of gulls and the rhythmic lap of waves against the shore. The city stirs slowly, not with the sudden rush of alarm, but with the quiet rhythm of daily life. A woman drawing water from a fountain, a child rubbing sleep from their eyes, a dog lifting its head at the sound of a familiar voice. There is no sense of danger here, no shadow of what is to come, only the familiar comfort of routine, of knowing where each path leads and who lives behind each door. In the market square, the day begins with a murmur that grows steadily into a low, steady hum, the sound of voices rising and falling like waves on the shore. Vendors arrive with baskets balanced on their shoulders, clay jars cradled in their arms, wooden carts creaking on uneven stone. One man arranges figs in a circular pattern, their dark purple skins glistening with moisture, while another pours olive oil from a large amphora into smaller vessels, the liquid golden and thick, catching the light as it flows. The air fills with familiar smells, ripe fruit, dried herbs, fish still cool from the morning catch, and the warm yeasty aroma of bread that rises from the communal ovens tucked in the corners of the district. A merchant checks the hinges of his stall, adjusts a cloth awning to block the coming sun, and greets a neighbor with a nod and a few quiet words about the weather, the price of grain, the health of their families. These are not grand conversations, but they are full of meaning, woven into the fabric of a life that feels stable, predictable, and safe. A baker stirs the embers in his oven, his face lined with years of heat and labor, his arms strong from kneading dough before sunrise. He checks the temperature with a practiced hand, feeling the wave of warmth that rolls out when he lifts the heavy lid. Satisfied, he slides in a new tray of loaves, their surfaces dusted with flour, their edges already beginning to crisp. The scent spreads quickly, wrapping the neighborhood in warmth, drawing children and neighbors alike with its promise of nourishment and comfort. Nearby, a donkey stands patiently, blindfolded, turning the millstone that grinds grain into flour. Its slow, steady steps are part of the rhythm of the city, as natural as the tide or the turning of the sun. The baker wipes sweat from his brow, takes a sip of water from a clay cup, and watches the rising smoke from his chimney blend into the morning sky, unaware that this fire, so small and domestic, shares its origin with a far greater one sleeping beneath the mountain in the distance. Children begin to appear, drawn by the promise of food or the freedom of the open streets. A boy no older than 7 sits on a step, chewing on a piece of flatbread, his feet swinging just above the ground. His tunic is slightly too big, sleeves rolled up, and one sandal is missing its strap. He watches the world with quiet curiosity, taking in the movement, the voices, the way a dog barks at a passing cat without real intent. A little farther on, 2 girls skip between puddles, their laughter light and clear, their hair braided with simple ribbons. They stop to look at a mosaic on the floor of a shop entrance, a dog with a collar, and the words Cave Canem written in red tile, and one of them giggles, pointing at the image as if it were alive. Their parents call them gently from doorways, reminding them of chores, of lessons, of meals to come, and the children respond with nods or promises they may or may not keep, their minds still full of games and dreams. Inside a modest home, a woman kneels by a small wooden chest, pulling out folded linens and placing them neatly on a bench. Her fingers move with care, smoothing each cloth as if the act itself holds meaning, as if the neatness of the household reflects the order of her heart. A child sleeps in a cradle nearby, wrapped in a soft woolen blanket, one tiny hand curled near their face. The woman pauses, watches the rise and fall of the child's chest, then rises and steps into the atrium, where a shallow pool collects rainwater beneath an open roof. She dips a jug into the water, lifts it slowly, and carries it back inside, her footsteps silent on the mosaic floor that depicts a dolphin leaping through waves. The home is simple but cared for, the walls painted in soft reds and yellows, the furniture worn but sturdy. This is not a life of luxury, but it is a life of dignity, of love, of quiet pride in the small things that make a day complete. In a larger house with painted walls and a garden enclosed by colonnades, a slave woman sweeps fallen petals from the path with a broom made of twigs. Her movements are slow, deliberate, each stroke precise, her body bent with years of labor, yet still strong. Around her, the garden blooms with roses, myrtle, and violets, their colors vivid against the white stone. A fountain trickles softly in the center, its basin shaped like a shell, water spilling gently from the mouth of a stone nymph. She pauses to adjust the jug of water she will later use to nourish the plants, then continues, her shadow moving with her across the ground, a silent companion in the morning light. She does not speak, but her presence is felt in the cleanliness of the path, in the care given to each plant, in the way she avoids stepping on a small lizard that darts across the stone. This is her world, not by choice, but by circumstance, and within it, she finds moments of peace, of purpose, of quiet beauty. A man walks through the forum, his sandals tapping softly against the stone, his tunic clean but simple. He carries a wax tablet in one hand, a stylus tucked into his belt. He stops to greet a friend, and they exchange a few words about the weather, the price of grain, the upcoming games at the amphitheater. There is no urgency in their voices, no sense of impending change. They speak of life as it is lived, with routines, with concerns, with small hopes. After a moment, they part with a nod, and each continues on their way, absorbed in the quiet purpose of the day. The forum itself is alive with activity, merchants arranging goods, officials reviewing scrolls, a priest lighting incense at a small shrine. The columns stand tall and steady, their capitals carved with acanthus leaves, their shadows shifting slowly as the sun climbs. This is the heart of the city, not in size, but in spirit, a place where decisions are made, friendships renewed, and life continues, one step at a time. In a small workshop near the city gate, a potter shapes clay on a spinning wheel, his hands moving with the confidence of decades. The vessel rises slowly beneath his fingers, round and smooth, its walls thin and even. He hums a tune without words, something passed down from his father perhaps, or learned in childhood. Beside him, Finished pots dry in the sun, arranged in rows like sleeping creatures. A cat lies curled in the shade, one paw twitching as it dreams. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke, and the only sounds are the soft whir of the wheel and the distant cry of a bird. His son watches from the doorway, silent, studying every movement, learning not just the craft, but the patience it requires. The potter does not rush. He knows that beauty cannot be forced, that a single misstep can ruin hours of work, that the true skill lies not in speed, but in stillness. A fisherman returns from the shore, his net slung over his shoulder, his sandals damp with seawater. He pauses at the edge of the city, looking back at the bay, where the light dances on the waves and a few small boats drift near the coast. He breathes deeply, as if storing the scent of the sea in his lungs, before stepping into the warmth of the streets. At home, his wife will clean the fish, save what they need, and sell the rest at the market tomorrow. This is their life, not grand, not remarkable, but full in its own way, woven from small, repeated acts of care. He thinks of his daughter, who will start her lessons with the neighborhood tutor next week, and smiles faintly. He does not know that this smile, this thought, this quiet pride will become part of what remains, not in stone, but in the fragile, enduring record of a life lived with love. A priest lights incense in a small temple near the baths, the smoke rising in a thin, winding column that vanishes into the brightening sky. He murmurs a prayer to Mercury, god of trade and travelers, asking for fairness in business and safety on the roads. A merchant passing by pauses, touches his fingers to his lips, then to the stone of the altar, a small gesture, automatic, but full of meaning. The priest does not see it, but it does not matter. Faith here is not loud or dramatic. It is woven into the fabric of the day, as natural as breathing, as essential as water. The temple is simple, its walls painted with images of offerings and journeys, its floor worn smooth by countless footsteps. No one kneels for long, no one speaks in loud declarations. They come, they pray, they go, carrying their hopes with them into the streets. In a house near the amphitheater, a young man reads from a scroll by the light of a window, his fingers tracing the lines of poetry written by Virgil. He stops occasionally to repeat a phrase, savoring the rhythm of the words, the way they echo in his mind like music. His tutor will arrive soon, and he wants to be ready not just with memorization, but with understanding. On the table beside him, a cup of water sits untouched, a single leaf floating on its surface. He does not notice it. He is lost in another world, one of heroes and rivers, of love and loss, unaware that his own story is unfolding in real time, just outside the door. His mother watches from the hallway, silent, proud, and turns away to continue her work, knowing that education is one of the greatest gifts she can give. A woman walks with a basket on her hip, her steps measured, her gaze calm. She passes a wall covered in graffiti, not vandalism, but messages left by neighbors. A joke, a declaration of love, a political slogan for a local candidate. One reads, "I enjoyed myself here," as if someone had paused to leave a note for the future. She smiles slightly, recognizing the handwriting of a friend, then continues on her way, her shadow stretching behind her like a quiet companion. She does not think of legacy, of memory, of time. She thinks of the bread she must buy, the herbs for dinner, the child waiting at home. And yet, in this moment, she becomes part of the texture of the city. Not a name, not a face remembered, but a presence, a movement, a thread in the fabric of a day that will never return. The sun climbs higher now, warming the city fully. The fountains sparkle, the gardens glow. The scent of bread spreads through the streets, mingling with the salt air and the faint musk of animals. A dog lies curled in the shade of a shop, its chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. A child naps on a bench, covered by a light cloth, a thumb resting near their mouth. Life moves at its own pace, not rushed, not delayed, simply present. A slave pours wine for his master in a shaded courtyard. A girl practices her letters on a wax tablet. An old man sits on a step, watching the world go by, his hands resting on a wooden staff. There is no grand event today, no festival, no announcement, just the steady pulse of a city living in the fullness of its ordinary existence. In the distance, beyond the vineyards and olive groves that cling to the hills, the great mountain rises. It is green with vegetation, dotted with farms and paths, its slopes familiar and unremarkable. Smoke does not rise from its peak. The earth does not tremble. Birds fly over it without fear. To the people of Pompeii, it is not a threat, not a force of nature, but simply part of the landscape, as constant as the sea, as ordinary as the sun. They do not feel the pressure building deep below, the slow shift of rock and fire, the weight of centuries waiting to be released. They do not know that this mountain, so still, so silent, so unchanging, is already dreaming of eruption. But even if they did, they might not believe it. For how could something so peaceful, so deeply woven into the beauty of their world, ever turn against them? And so the city continues, unaware, unafraid, alive in every breath, every step, every quiet gesture of a life that believes in tomorrow. The bread is warm, the water is cool, the children are laughing. The day is just beginning, not as a dramatic prelude, but as a continuation of all that has come before. This is not the calm before the storm, not in their eyes. This is simply life, as it has always been, as they assume it always will be. And in that assumption, in that quiet certainty, lies the deepest truth of Pompeii, that civilizations do not fall in moments of chaos, but in moments of peace when no one is watching the sky. The morning continues as mornings have always done in Pompeii, with bread pulled from ovens, with children running through streets, with merchants arranging their goods beneath cloth awnings that flutter in the breeze. The sun climbs higher, warming the stone of the forum, gilding the edges of rooftops, casting long shadows that slowly shorten as the day unfolds. There is no alarm, no sense of urgency, only the steady rhythm of life that has repeated itself for generations. And yet, beneath the surface of this ordinary day, something shifts, not with a roar, not with a cry, but with a silence so slight it might be mistaken for imagination. A dog stops barking mid-sound, ears pricked, head turning toward the mountain. A bird that had been singing in a fig tree suddenly takes flight, not in panic, but in quiet departure, as if deciding, without reason, that it was time to go, as if the air had grown too still to trust. Later, near the edge of the city where the houses thin out and vineyards begin to climb the lower slopes, a farmer pauses while pruning his grapevines. He feels it through the soles of his sandals, a faint vibration, deep and low, like the rumble of a distant cart rolling over stone. He straightens, looks around, but sees nothing. The air is still, the sky is clear. His neighbor, working a few rows away, does not seem to have noticed. The man wipes his hands on his tunic, shakes his head slightly, and returns to his task. It was nothing, he tells himself. The earth settles sometimes. It has always done so. And yet, for a moment, he had felt it, not in his feet alone, but in his chest, as if the ground had exhaled beneath him, as if something deep below had stirred in its sleep, not with anger, not with warning, but with the slow, unconscious movement of something ancient adjusting its weight after centuries of stillness. In the marketplace, a woman filling her jug at the public fountain feels the water tremble. The surface, usually still, ripples in small, concentric circles, though no one has touched it, no child has thrown a stone. She watches it, frowning slightly, then glances up at the sky as if expecting rain. But the clouds are high and thin, moving slowly, not a drop in sight. She dips the jug again, lifts it, and carries it back to her stall, where she sells garlands of jasmine and rosemary. She does not speak of what she saw. It was likely just a tremor, one of many that have come and gone over the years. The city has stood through them all. Still, she places the jug down more carefully than usual, as if handling something fragile, as if the act of carrying water had suddenly taken on a meaning beyond the everyday, as if the balance of the world were somehow reflected in the stillness of the liquid she had drawn from the earth. A potter working at his wheel feels the clay wobble beneath his fingers. He pauses, adjusts his hands, thinking he has lost his balance. But the wheel is steady. The ground is solid. And yet, for a moment, the vessel he was shaping leaned to one side, as if pulled by an invisible hand. He examines the base, checks the axle, finds nothing wrong. He starts again, more slowly this time, his movements deliberate. Around him, the other artisans in the workshop continue their work. One engraving a cup, another polishing a lamp, none of them speaking of what they may or may not have felt. These small disturbances are part of living near the mountain. They have names, terrae motus, earth tremors, and they pass like clouds. No one thinks of them as warnings. No one connects them to the great silence that waits beneath the soil. And yet, in the quiet of his focus, the potter notices that his hands tremble slightly, not from age, not from fatigue, but as if they were remembering a rhythm older than memory. In a house near the amphitheater, a young man reading Virgil looks up from his scroll, not because of sound, but because of stillness. The birds outside have stopped singing. The fountain in the garden, which had been trickling softly, now sits unnaturally still, its surface flat, as if the water itself were holding its breath. He listens. The city hums in the distance, voices, footsteps, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, but close by, there is a gap in the noise, a pocket of quiet that feels deliberate. He sets the scroll aside, walks to the window, and peers out. Everything appears normal. A slave sweeps the path. A child plays with a wooden horse. And yet the air feels heavier than before, as if the light itself had dimmed by the smallest degree. He cannot explain it. He does not try. He returns to his reading, though his thoughts linger on the silence, on the way the world sometimes pauses without announcement, as if waiting for something it does not name. A fisherman mending his net on the shore feels the line tremble in his hands, not from a fish, not from the tide, but from a pulse in the water, a deep rolling movement beneath the surface. He lifts his head, looks toward the open sea, but the waves are calm, the boats steady. He checks his anchor, finds it secure, and continues his work. Later, he will tell his wife that the sea felt strange that morning, as if it were breathing differently. She will nod, say that the wind had shifted, and that will be enough. They do not speak of omens. They speak of weather, of tides, of the way the world changes in small, predictable ways. And yet, in the back of his mind, the memory remains not of danger, but of a moment when the sea, so familiar, felt like a stranger, when the water carried a message his body understood before his mind could translate it. In the forum, an old man sitting on a stone bench feels a tremor pass through the soles of his feet. He does not startle. He has lived through many such moments. But this one feels different, deeper, slower, more sustained. He places a hand flat on the stone beside him and waits. The vibration fades, like a sigh disappearing into the air. A merchant passing by notices his stillness and asks if he is unwell. The old man shakes his head, smiles faintly, and says only, "The earth dreams." The merchant chuckles, assumes he means a joke, and moves on. But the old man does not laugh. He watches the mountain in the distance, its green slopes bathed in sunlight, and wonders if dreams can ever become real, if the ground beneath their feet could one day wake from its long slumber and remember what it once was, before vineyards and homes, before roads and prayers. A slave girl drawing water from a well in the back courtyard of a large home, notices that the bucket is harder to pull up than usual. The rope catches, the pulley groans as if something below is resisting. She pauses, listens. From deep within the shaft, she thinks she hears a low, hollow sound. Not a voice, not an animal, but a resonance, like stone pressing against stone. She waits, breathes, then pulls again, this time with more force. The bucket rises, splashing slightly as it breaks the surface. The water inside is clear, unchanged. She carries it inside, saying nothing. She has learned not to speak of things she cannot explain. But that night, she will dream of darkness moving beneath the city, of tunnels filling with heat, of a breath too long held, and she will wake with a start, not from fear, but from the certainty that the earth is not as still as it seems. In the baths, a man soaking in the warm room feels the water ripple without cause. He opens his eyes, looks around. No one has entered. No attendant has stirred the surface. And yet the water moves, not violently, but with a slow undulating motion, as if something beneath the foundation of the building had shifted. He lifts a hand, watches the droplets fall back into the pool, creating their own small waves. He thinks of earthquakes, of course, but dismisses the thought. The last one was years ago. This was smaller, barely noticeable. Still, he stays in the water a little longer than usual, as if its warmth could protect him from whatever stirs below, as if the ritual of cleansing could shield him from forces he does not yet understand. A dog tied near a bakery lifts its head, ears alert, staring toward the mountain. Its owner, sweeping the entrance, calls its name, but the animal does not respond. It whines once, low and soft, then lies down again, pressing its body close to the stone. The man shrugs, tosses it a scrap of bread, and goes back to work. But the dog does not eat. It watches the sky, its body tense in a way that suggests not fear, but recognition, as if it knows something the humans do not, as if its instincts hear a language lost to memory, as if the silence of the birds, the stillness of the air, the weight in the ground were all signs in a script only animals can read. A child playing in the street stops suddenly, hands pressed to the ground. "The earth tickled me," he says to his friend, laughing. The other child tries it, pressing their palms to the stone, but feels nothing. They run off again, forgetting the moment. But the first child remembers. Years later, as an old man, he will recall that sensation, not as a tremor, not as a warning, but as the last time the world felt alive beneath his hands, as if the city itself had reached up to touch him before vanishing into ash and silence. In a small temple, a priest lighting incense pauses as the flame on the altar flickers without wind. He watches it, waits. The smoke, usually rising in a thin, steady column, curls sideways for a moment, then returns to its path. He says nothing. He has seen stranger things. But he adds an extra pinch of resin to the fire, a small offering to the gods of the earth, just in case. He does not believe the mountain will wake, but he believes in caution. He believes in balance. And he believes that sometimes the world speaks in whispers, not shouts, in signs that fade before they can be named, in movements so subtle they are felt only by those who are not too busy to notice. A woman walking home with a basket of herbs stops at the edge of a narrow alley and feels the air change. It is not colder, not hotter, but heavier, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. She breathes in, expecting the scent of salt or bread, but instead catches a faint metallic tang, like iron, or stone heated beyond its limit. She looks around, sees nothing unusual, and continues on her way. But she walks a little faster, not because she is afraid, but because something in her bones tells her that the day is no longer quite the same, that the rhythm of the city has shifted in a way she cannot measure, but cannot ignore. Even the birds seem to know. Swallows that usually dart through the streets in tight, playful groups now fly in straight lines, low and fast, toward the open fields. Pigeons gather in clusters on rooftops, silent, unmoving, their heads turning in unison at the slightest sound. A crow lands on a statue in the forum, caws once, and flies away without circling. These are not behaviors that people stop to study. They are background details, like the color of the sky or the direction of the wind. And yet, together, they form a pattern, not of fear, but of instinct, of creatures attuned to rhythms humans have long forgotten, of a world where some beings still listen to the pulse of the earth, even when others have stopped feeling it. And still, the city lives. The bread is baked. The children play. The fountains flow. The sun moves across the sky, and the shadows shift as they always have. No one gathers in the forum to demand answers. No one calls for priests to interpret signs. These whispers are too faint, too scattered, too easily explained away. They are not the voice of a god. They are not a prophecy. They are only the quiet creaking of a world adjusting its weight, the slow, unconscious movement of something ancient, deep, and unaware of the lives it carries on its back. And yet, for those who had felt the tremor in their hands, the stillness in the air, the silence in the water, the path had already begun, not as a journey they chose, but as a quiet unfolding they could not yet name, a thread of change pulling them forward, one unnoticed moment at a time. As the sun climbs toward the center of the sky, its light spreads across the city with a warmth that feels almost protective, as if the heavens themselves were trying to reassure the people below that all was still well. The streets, still dusted with morning dew in their shaded corners, begin to dry under the steady glow, releasing a faint, earthy scent that mingles with the aroma of bread from the ovens and the salt carried in from the sea. Children run through the alleys, their laughter echoing between the high walls of homes painted in soft reds and yellows, while vendors rearrange their wares with the slow rhythm of a day that has no reason to rush. And yet, beneath this surface of normalcy, something lingers, not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling, like the memory of a dream just before it fades, like the weight of a hand that brushes your shoulder when you are alone. It is not fear, not yet, but the quiet recognition that the world has shifted in a way too subtle to measure, too deep to ignore. In a narrow lane near the market, a woman kneels beside a public fountain, filling her clay jug with water drawn from the city's aqueduct, a system of channels and pipes that has carried life through Pompeii for generations. She does it slowly, carefully, watching the surface of the water as it rises, not because she expects to see anything unusual, but because her body has learned to pay attention to what the mind might dismiss. The liquid is clear, cool, untouched by dirt or debris, and yet, as she lifts the jug, she feels a tremor pass through her arms, not from her own movement, but from a vibration beneath her feet so faint it might have been imagined. She sets the jug down, places her palm flat on the stone edge of the basin, and waits. The ripple in the water stops. The birds above fall silent. The air, once warm and still, now carries a breath of something metallic, like iron left too long in the rain. She does not speak of it. She does not call for help. She only stands, lifts the jug again, and walks home, her steps measured, her thoughts turned inward, as if carrying not just water, but a secret the earth has whispered only to her. A man returning from the forum pauses beneath the archway of his home, his hand resting on the lintel, carved with the image of a serpent, a symbol of protection passed down through his family for generations. He has just come from a meeting with other merchants, where they spoke of grain shipments, of prices in distant ports, of the upcoming festival in honor of Vulcan. No one mentioned the tremor. No one spoke of the stillness in the air. And yet he had felt it, not in the ground, but in the silence between words, in the way his friend hesitated before laughing, in the way a dog had barked once, sharply, then fallen quiet. Now, as he stands in the threshold of his house, he looks back toward the mountain, its green slopes bathed in sunlight, its presence so constant it has become invisible. But today, he sees it differently, not as a backdrop, not as a hill covered in vines, but as something alive, something watching. He does not believe in omens. He believes in work, in family, in the strength of stone and mortar. And yet, he turns and walks inside, not to rest, but to find his wife, to sit with her in the atrium, to feel the presence of another human being, while the world holds its breath. In a modest house near the baths, a mother kneels beside her sleeping child, a boy no older than 6, who had woken in the night, screaming that the sky was falling. She had held him, whispered that it was only a dream, that the roof was strong, that the gods were watching. He had calmed eventually, and fallen into a deep sleep, his breath slow and even, one hand curled near his face, as if holding on to something unseen. Now, as she watches him, she feels the same fear rise in her chest, not for herself, but for him, for the life he has only just begun. She thinks of the stories her grandmother used to tell, of cities swallowed by the sea, of mountains that once walked. She had always thought them fables, meant to teach children to respect the earth. But now, as she listens to the silence outside, as she feels the stillness in the air, she wonders if some stories are not made up, but remembered, passed down through generations, because they were true, because they had happened before, and because the earth, in its long memory, never forgets. A merchant in the marketplace begins to gather his goods earlier than usual, folding cloths over jars of oil, baskets of herbs, bundles of cloth from the east. He does not hurry. He does not call to his apprentice with urgency. But his movements are deliberate, each action weighted with a meaning he cannot name. His donkey, usually calm, had refused to drink from the trough this morning, turning its head away, its ears flat, its eyes wide with something that looked like recognition. He had patted its neck, spoken softly, but the animal would not drink. Now, as he secures the flaps of his stall with leather ties, he thinks of his family. His wife, his 2 daughters, the youngest still a baby, and of the road that leads north toward Nusharia, where his brother lives on a small farm beyond the hills. He does not know if they will go. He does not know if they should. But he packs a small sack with dried fruit, cheese, and a waterskin, and places it by the door, where it can be taken quickly if the time comes. In a home with a garden painted in frescoes of birds and flowers, a man sits at a small wooden table, writing a letter to his brother in Capua. His stylus moves slowly across the wax tablet, forming words with care, not because he fears being misunderstood, but because he knows this may be the last message he sends. He does not speak of fear. He does not mention the tremors, the stillness, the way the birds have stopped singing. Instead, he writes of their childhood, of the way they used to climb the hills outside the city and pretend they were explorers discovering new lands. He says he hopes to visit soon, that he misses the sound of the wind in the olive trees. He asks his brother to remember him kindly, to tell his nieces and nephews stories of their uncle, if the years carry him away before they can meet. When he finishes, he seals the tablet in a wooden box with others, as if storing memories for a journey he is not sure he will make. A slave woman working in the kitchen pauses while grinding herbs, her hand still on the pestle, her eyes fixed on the small window that looks out to the street. She has lived in this house for 20 years, since she was a girl, and she knows its rhythms better than her own breath. But today, the silence feels different. The birds have not returned to the fig tree. The fountains are still. Even the distant sound of the sea, usually a constant murmur, seems to have faded. She thinks of her mother, who used to say that animals know when the earth dreams, that dogs and birds and snakes feel the stirrings long before humans do. She thinks of the old woman in the next street who released her chickens that morning, saying they would not survive what was coming. No one laughed. No one argued. They simply watch the birds fly away, their wings beating against the heavy air. She does not leave. She does not speak. But she stops grinding, places the pestle down gently, and walks to the back door, where she stands for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the unseen. An elderly priest sits in the shade of a colonnade, sipping water from a clay cup, his eyes closed, his hands resting on his knees. A younger man approaches, hesitant, and asks if the gods have spoken, if there is a sign he has missed. The priest does not open his eyes. He says only that the gods do not shout. They whisper in the stillness, in the way water trembles, in the way a dog refuses to eat, in the way a child wakes from a dream with tears on their face. He says he has lit extra incense at the shrine of Vulcan, not because he believes that God will listen, but because the act of offering is its own kind of peace. He does not tell the man to leave. He does not tell him to stay. He only says that sometimes the first step is not a journey, but a breath, a single moment of stillness before the world begins to move again. In a bakery, the oven is extinguished earlier than usual. The baker covers the remaining dough with a cloth, not to let it rise, but to preserve it, as if storing it for a time when bread might be hard to find. His wife packs a small sack with dried fruit, cheese, and a water skin, then places it by the door, where it can be grabbed quickly. They do not speak of leaving. They do not say they are afraid, but they move with a quiet purpose, as if preparing for a storm that has not yet been seen. Their daughter watches from the corner, silent, her doll clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with a kind of understanding that children often have before words can explain it. A fisherman on the shore checks the knots on his boat, tightens the ropes, secures the sail. He does not plan to go out today. The sea has been too still, too quiet, as if holding its breath. But he prepares the vessel anyway, as if the act of readiness could bring order back to a world that feels unbalanced. His son asks if they are going to sail, and he says no, not today. But he adds, quietly, that they might need to soon. The boy does not press him. He only nods and helps coil the rope, his small hands moving with the same care his father has always shown. In the forum, a group of men gather near the steps of the temple, not for debate or business, but simply to be together. They do not speak much. They sit on the stone benches, watching the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces, as if storing it. One of them mentions that his uncle in Herculaneum sent a message, not written, but carried by a runner, saying the wells there had begun to bubble, and the water tasted bitter. No one reacts with alarm. No one calls for the magistrates. But the silence that follows is deeper than before, as if each man were measuring the weight of his own life against the vast, unknowable force of the earth beneath them. A mother walks through the market, her hand holding her child's tightly, her steps quicker than usual. She does not buy bread or herbs. She only looks, listens, feels the air on her skin. She passes a wall where someone has scratched a message in the plaster. We were here. She stops, traces the letters with her finger, then moves on, her heart full of a love so deep it feels like sorrow. She does not know what is coming. She only knows that she wants to keep her child close, that she wants to remember this moment, the warmth of the hand in hers, the sound of footsteps on stone, the way the light falls across the street as clearly as possible. In a workshop near the city gate, a potter packs his tools into a wooden chest, wrapping each chisel and scraper in cloth. His apprentice watches, silent, then asks if they are leaving. The potter says he does not know. He says only that he has lived through tremors before, but this one feels different, not in strength, but in quality, like the silence before a storm, like the pause before a breath is taken. He says he will wait until tomorrow, but he packs the chest anyway, placing it near the door, where it can be carried easily. A young woman sits in her garden, writing in a small wax tablet. She does not record the events of the day. She writes a letter to no one, words that flow like water. If you are reading this, I hope you know that I loved the light in the morning, the way it touched the roses, the sound of my mother's voice calling me to dinner. I hope you know that I tried to be kind, that I watered the plants even when I was tired, that I smiled at strangers, because I believed the world was good. She does not name the fear. She does not speak of the mountain. But in every line, there is a quiet farewell, a recognition that some doors, once closed, may never open again. And still, most people go about their day. Bread is baked. Children play. Water is drawn. Lovers meet in quiet corners. A slave sweeps the path. A poet reads by the window. The city lives, not in denial, but in the quiet courage of those who do not know what comes next, but continue anyway. Because sometimes the first step is not a flight, not a cry, not a prayer. It is simply the act of breathing, of standing, of being present in a world that is changing beneath your feet, one unnoticed moment at a time. As the afternoon light begins to shift across the rooftops of Pompeii, it no longer spills in golden waves over the terracotta tiles, but settles with a strange coppery hue that seems to come from within the air itself, as if the atmosphere had thickened and begun to glow from the inside. The heat, once comforting, now feels heavy on the skin, not from the sun, but from a stillness that has grown too deep, too prolonged, as if the city were holding its breath. In the narrow streets, the usual rhythm of footsteps has slowed, not because people are absent, but because they move with a new awareness, their sandals tapping softly against the stone, their eyes lifting not to greet neighbors, but toward the mountain that rises in the distance, its green slopes unchanged, yet suddenly unfamiliar. A child runs through an alley, but is called back by a voice, sharper than usual, more urgent, and the laughter that follows is brief, as if even joy has learned to be careful. In the marketplace, the usual hum of bargaining and laughter has dissolved into clusters of quiet conversation, groups of people standing close together, speaking in low voices about the tremors, about the stillness in the wells, about the way the birds have not returned to the fig trees. A merchant from Nuceria, who arrived that morning with a cart of wool and dried fruit, announces he will not stay the night. He says nothing dramatic, only that he feels it is time to go, that his family awaits, that the road is long. No one questions him. No one tries to stop him. They watch as he packs his goods, checks the straps on his mules, and sets off toward the northern gate, his cart creaking on the uneven stone. Others see him leave and feel something shift inside them. Not fear, not exactly, but the slow recognition that movement is possible, that leaving is an option, that the world beyond the city still exists, still breathes, still waits. A family gathers in the atrium of their home, the parents kneeling to speak to their two young children, their voices calm but deliberate, explaining that they may travel to the countryside for a few days, that it is not because anything is wrong, but because the air in the city feels heavy, because the mountain has been restless, because sometimes it is wise to rest in a different place. The children do not cry. They do not ask many questions, but they pack their small belongings with a seriousness that belies their age. A wooden horse, a doll wrapped in cloth, a cup they do not want to leave behind. The mother places a sack of bread, cheese, and olives beside the door, along with waterskins and cloaks for the journey. The father checks the hinges on the shutters, secures the chest where they keep their few coins, and whispers a prayer to the household gods, not for safety, but for clarity, for the strength to know what to do when the time comes. Near the city gate, a group of slaves gathers in the shade of a wall, not speaking much, but watching the road that leads north, where the first carts have already begun to disappear into the distance, their shapes growing smaller against the dusty horizon. The air around them is still, but charged with a kind of silence that feels like waiting. Not the peaceful quiet of midday, but the held breath before a storm, the pause between heartbeats when something has changed, but no one has yet spoken of it. These men and women have lived their lives within the rhythm of orders, within the boundaries of duty, their days measured by the tasks assigned to them, their movements dictated by the needs of others. But today, for the first time in years, perhaps in decades, they are not being told what to do. No master has called them back to the house. No voice has risen to demand their presence. And in that absence of command, a new space has opened, fragile, uncertain, but real. One of them, a man with hands worn by years of labor, speaks first, not loudly, but with a steadiness that carries through the stillness. He will not wait. He says he remembers a village near the coast, far from here, where the earth cracked open one morning and the sea rushed in, swallowing homes, fields, people, as if the world had decided to erase them. He was a boy then, and he ran. He did not think. He only moved. And now, though there is no water, though the ground does not split, he feels the same weight in the air, the same silence in the birds, the same tremor in the water when he dipped his hand into the well that morning. He says he will walk to Nola, where a cousin lives, and he will not look back. Another woman, who has served in the same household since childhood, says she cannot leave the old woman who raised her, who is too weak to travel. A young man, barely more than a boy, says he will go to the shore and see if any boats remain. They do not argue. They do not try to convince one another. They simply listen, and in that listening, they recognize something profound, that each of them, for the first time, is making a choice not as property, not as shadow, but as a person whose life has weight, whose steps matter, whose future is no longer written by another's hand. And so, without ceremony, without declaration, they begin to move, some toward the road, some back to the homes they have tended for years, some toward the unknown, each step a quiet act of courage, each decision a whisper of freedom in a world that has never allowed them to speak. One woman walks out with a bundle in her arms, not stolen, but gathered, a cup she once broke and repaired, a shawl her mother gave her, a small statue of a goddess she once prayed to in secret. She does not look back. She walks with her head high, as if for the first time she is moving toward something, not away. Another man pauses at the edge of the city, turns, and watches the rooftops, the columns, the streets where he has walked for 20 years. He does not cry. He does not speak. He only breathes deeply, as if storing the memory of this place in his lungs, then turns and walks north, his shadow stretching long behind him. In the forum, the usual activity has slowed. Merchants sit idle by their stalls. Officials have left their offices. A priest stands at the steps of the temple of Jupiter, lighting incense not for a festival, but for stillness, for peace, for the return of balance. He does not speak to the crowd, because there is no crowd. But those who pass by stop for a moment, touch their fingers to their lips, then to the stone of the altar, as if leaving a silent offering. A woman kneels and places a small clay figurine of a child at the base of the statue, then rises and walks away without looking back. No one knows what the gods want. No one knows if they are watching. But the act of giving something, a gesture, a prayer, a memory, feels like the only thing left to do. A fisherman and his family load their few possessions into a small boat at the shore. Blankets, jars of oil, a wooden chest with tools and clothes. They do not know where they will go. They only know they cannot stay. The sea, once calm, now ripples with an uneven rhythm, as if something beneath it is moving. The man checks the sails, secures the ropes, and helps his wife and daughter aboard. A neighbor watches from the beach and calls out, asking if they think it will come to that. The fisherman does not answer. He only nods, then pushes the boat into the water and begins to row, his strokes strong and steady, carrying them toward the open bay, where the horizon still holds the color of daylight. In a large house with a painted garden, an elderly man refuses to leave. His family pleads with him, tells him they have a cart ready, that they will take him to a villa in the hills. But he sits in his favorite chair, his hands resting on the arms, his eyes fixed on the fountain where water still trickles, though more slowly than before. He says he has lived in this house for 60 years, that he buried his wife beneath the myrtle tree, that he will not abandon her, not even for the mountain. His grandchildren kiss his hands and leave, carrying his favorite cup and a scroll he once wrote. He remains, not out of defiance, but out of love, out of the quiet certainty that some bonds are stronger than fear. The sky, as the sun begins to descend, no longer turns gold or pink, but a deep, unnatural gray, as if dusk has come early, as if the light is being swallowed. The air grows heavier, carrying a scent like burnt stone, like metal left in a fire. People light lamps earlier than usual, not because it is dark, but because the daylight feels false, as if it cannot be trusted. In the streets, fewer voices can be heard. Doors are closed, windows shuttered. And yet movement continues, not of crowds, but of individuals, families, small groups, each making their own choice, each taking their own path, as the city, once so full of life, begins to empty, not with noise, but with silence. A dog that had been tied near a bakery for years is finally untied by its owner, who says, "Run, if you want to." The animal does not bark. It does not jump. It only looks at the man for a long moment, then turns and runs toward the open fields, its paws silent on the stone. A slave woman walks out of a house with a bundle in her arms, not stolen, but gathered, a cup, a shawl, a small statue of a goddess. She does not look back. She walks with her head high, as if for the first time she is moving toward something, not away. And still some stay, not because they are brave, not because they do not feel the fear, but because they cannot imagine a world without this place, without these walls, without the sound of their child's laughter in the courtyard. They light the evening lamps. They prepare a simple meal. They sit together, hand in hand, and wait, not knowing what for, only knowing that they are here, now, alive, and that for this moment, the city still breathes. In a modest home near the baths, a mother kneels beside her sleeping child, pressing a damp cloth to the boy's forehead. He had woken again in the night, crying that the sky was falling. She had soothed him, whispered that it was only a dream, that the roof was strong, that the gods protected them. But now, as she watches his chest rise and fall in sleep, she feels the same tremor in her own hands, not from fear, but from a quiet certainty that something has changed. She rises, walks to the window, and looks out over the garden where the fountain still trickles. It sounds slower than usual, as if the water were tired. She does not pray. She does not call for help. She simply stands there, letting the stillness fill her, letting the weight of the unseen settle into her bones. A merchant in the marketplace begins to gather his goods earlier than usual, folding cloths over jars of oil, baskets of herbs, bundles of cloth from the east. He does not hurry. He does not call to his apprentice with urgency. But his movements are deliberate, each action weighted with a meaning he cannot name. His donkey, usually calm, had refused to drink from the trough this morning, turning its head away, its ears flat, its eyes wide with something that looked like recognition. He had patted its neck, spoken softly, but the animal would not drink. Now, as he secures the flaps of his stall with leather ties, he thinks of his family, his wife, his 2 daughters, the youngest still a baby, and of the road that leads north toward Nusheria, where his brother lives on a small farm beyond the hills. He does not know if they will go. He does not know if they should. But he packs a small sack with dried fruit, cheese, and a waterskin, and places it by the door, where it can be taken quickly if the time comes. An old man sits on a bench in the forum, watching the shadows shorten, then lengthen again as the sun begins its descent. He has lived in Pompeii all his life. He remembers the last great tremor, decades ago, The way the city cracked and then healed, the way life returned as if nothing had happened. But this feels different. The air is too still. The birds have not returned. The earth has not settled. He does not move from his seat. He does not pack a bag. He only watches, as if bearing witness were the most important thing he could do, as if, by staying, he could hold the memory of this place a little longer. Because the world was in motion, not with speed, not with noise, but with the quiet, inevitable turning of a page, the slow unfolding of a story that no one had chosen, but that everyone was now living. One step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. As the light of day begins to fade into a sky that no longer turns gold or pink, but a deep, unnatural gray, the city feels different, not because of noise, but because of the silence that has settled into its streets. A silence that is not empty, but full of thoughts too heavy to speak, of glances held too long, of hands that reach for one another without knowing why. The air carries a scent like burnt stone, like metal left too long in a fire, and the warmth of the sun has been replaced by a stillness that presses against the skin, as if the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. In homes where lamps are lit earlier than usual, families gather not for dinner, but for presence, for the simple act of being together while the world shifts beneath their feet, each person carrying a decision they have not yet voiced, each heart weighing options they have no right answer. A woman kneels beside her sleeping child, one hand resting on the boy's chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, the warmth of his skin, the way his fingers curl around the edge of the blanket as if holding on to something unseen. She had promised him they would not leave, that the house was safe, that the mountain would not wake. But now, as she listens to the silence outside, as she feels the faint tremor in the stone floor beneath her knees, she wonders if love sometimes means breaking a promise. She thinks of the road north, of the cousin who lives in NOLA, of the open fields where the air is clean and the earth feels solid. She thinks of carrying her son through the night, of walking until her legs fail, of never looking back. But she also thinks of her mother, too old to travel, too weak to stand, waiting in a house near the baths. To leave one is to abandon the other. And so she sits, not moving, not speaking, letting the weight of the choice fill the room like smoke, knowing that whatever she decides, something precious will be lost. In a modest home near the Forum, a man sits at a small table, rolling a piece of parchment into a cylinder and sealing it with wax. It is a letter to his brother in Capua, short and careful in its wording. He does not speak of fear. He does not mention the tremors or the stillness in the air. But he writes that he has been thinking of their childhood, of the way they used to climb the hills outside the city and pretend they were explorers discovering new lands. He says he hopes to visit soon, that he misses the sound of the wind in the olive trees. He does not say that he is afraid. He does not say that he does not know if he will have the chance. He only asks his brother to remember him kindly, to tell his nieces and nephews stories of their uncle, if the years carry him away before they can meet. When he finishes, he places the letter in a wooden box with others, as if storing memories for a journey he is not sure he will make. He does not pack a bag. He does not call to his wife. He only sits there, his hands resting on the table as if waiting for a sign that will never come. A slave woman working in the kitchen pauses while grinding herbs, her hand still on the pestle, her eyes fixed on the small window that looks out to the street. She has lived in this house for 20 years, since she was a girl, and she knows its rhythms better than her own breath. But today, the silence feels different. The birds have not returned to the fig tree. The fountains are still. Even the distant sound of the sea, usually a constant murmur, seems to have faded. She thinks of her mother, who used to say that animals know when the earth dreams, that dogs and birds and snakes feel the stirrings long before humans do. She thinks of the old woman in the next street who released her chickens that morning, saying they would not survive what was coming. No one laughed. No one argued. They simply watched the birds fly away, their wings beating against the heavy air. Now, as she stands in the kitchen, she feels the same pull, not to run, not to hide, but to move, to take the few things that are hers, to walk toward the north road and not look back. But she also thinks of the master's daughter, who is ill, who cannot walk, who depends on her for water, for food, for comfort. To leave is to survive. To stay is to serve. And yet, in that moment, she wonders if serving another's life might also be a way of claiming her own. An elderly priest sits in the shade of a colonnade, sipping water from a clay cup, his eyes closed, his hands resting on his knees. A younger man approaches, hesitant, and asks if the gods have spoken, if there is a sign he has missed. The priest does not open his eyes. He says only that the gods do not shout. They whisper in the stillness, in the way water trembles, in the way a dog refuses to eat, in the way a child wakes from a dream with tears on their face. He says he has lit extra incense at the shrine of Vulcan, not because he believes the god will listen, but because the act of offering is its own kind of peace. He does not tell the man to leave. He does not tell him to stay. He only says that sometimes the first step is not a journey, but a breath, a single moment of stillness before the world begins to move again. And yet, inside, he carries his own conflict. He has lived in this city for 60 years, and he knows every stone of the temple, every prayer carved into the walls. To abandon, it feels like betrayal, but to remain may mean silence. He does not know what the gods want. He only knows that his hands still tremble when he lights the flame. In a bakery, the oven is extinguished earlier than usual. The baker covers the remaining dough with a cloth, not to let it rise, but to preserve it, as if storing it for a time when bread might be hard to find. His wife packs a small sack with dried fruit, cheese, and a water skin, then places it by the door, where it can be grabbed quickly. They do not speak of leaving. They do not say they are afraid. But they move with a quiet purpose, as if preparing for a storm that has not yet been seen. Their daughter watches from the corner, silent, her doll clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with a kind of understanding that children often have before words can explain it. The baker looks at her, and for the first time, he feels the full weight of being a father, not in the daily acts of care, but in the possibility of losing her. He thinks of the road, of the carts that have already left, of the ones that may not make it. He thinks of staying, of locking the door, of waiting it out. But he also thinks of her laughter, of the way she dances in the morning light, and he knows that if he can carry her even 1 mile farther from this place, it will be worth every step. A fisherman on the shore checks the knots on his boat, tightens the ropes, secures the sail. He does not plan to go out today. The sea has been too still, too quiet, as if holding its breath. But he prepares the vessel anyway, as if the act of readiness could bring order back to a world that feels unbalanced. His son asks if they are going to sail, and he says no, not today. But he adds quietly that they might need to soon. The boy does not press him. He only nods and helps coil the rope, his small hands moving with the same care his father has always shown. Inside, the fisherman wrestles with a choice he cannot name: to take the boat into the open bay, where the horizon still holds the color of daylight, or to stay and help others who have no way to leave. He knows the sea better than anyone. He knows its rhythms, its dangers, its silences. But he also knows that not every family has a boat, that not every child can swim, that some will wait until it is too late. And so he stands there, hands on the railing, staring at the water, wondering if courage is in leaving or in staying. In the forum, a group of men gather near the steps of the temple, not for debate or business, but simply to be together. They do not speak much. They sit on the stone benches, watching the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces, as if storing it. One of them mentions that his uncle in Herculaneum sent a message, not written, but carried by a runner, saying the wells there had begun to bubble, and the water tasted bitter. No one reacts with alarm. No one calls for the magistrates. But the silence that follows is deeper than before, as if each man were measuring the weight of his own life against the vast, unknowable force of the earth beneath them. One of them, a merchant, says he will leave at first light. Another, a builder, says he will stay to help secure the homes of those who cannot go. A third, a veteran of the legions, says nothing. He only looks at his hands, worn by years of labor, and thinks of the battles he has survived, the friends he has lost, the way fear used to taste like iron. Now it tastes like stillness. A mother walks through the market, her hand holding her child's tightly, her steps quicker than usual. She does not buy bread or herbs. She only looks, listens, feels the air on her skin. She passes a wall where someone has scratched a message in the plaster. We were here. She stops, traces the letters with her finger, then moves on, her heart full of a love so deep it feels like sorrow. She does not know what is coming. She only knows that she wants to keep her child close, that she wants to remember this moment, the warmth of the hand in hers, the sound of footsteps on stone, the way the light falls across the street, as clearly as possible. And yet she also thinks of her sister, who lives in a house near the base of the mountain, who is pregnant, who cannot travel easily. To go to her may mean not returning. To stay away may mean leaving her behind. She walks on, her mind torn, her heart pulled in two directions, neither of which leads to peace. In a large house with a painted garden, an elderly man refuses to leave. His family pleads with him, tells him they have a cart ready, that they will take him to a villa in the hills. But he sits in his favorite chair, his hands resting on the arms, his eyes fixed on the fountain where water still trickles, though more slowly than before. He says he has lived in this house for 60 years, that he buried his wife beneath the myrtle tree, that he will not abandon her, not even for the mountain. His grandchildren kiss his hands and leave, carrying his favorite cup and a scroll he once wrote. He remains, not out of defiance, but out of love, out of the quiet certainty that some bonds are stronger than fear. And yet, in the hours that follow, as the sky darkens and the air grows heavier, he does not sleep. He sits awake, listening to the silence, wondering if staying is courage or pride, if love can survive without presence, if memory is enough. A young woman sits in her garden, writing in a small wax tablet. She does not record the events of the day. She writes a letter to no one, words that flow like water. If you are reading this, I hope you know that I love the light in the morning, the way it touched the roses, the sound of my mother's voice calling me to dinner. I hope you know that I tried to be kind, that I watered the plants even when I was tired, that I smiled at strangers because I believed the world was good. She does not name the fear. She does not speak of the mountain. But in every line there is a quiet farewell, a recognition that some doors, once closed, may never open again. And yet she does not leave. She stays, not because she is afraid to go, but because she cannot imagine a life without this garden, without these walls, without the memory of her father walking these paths. In her stillness there is a kind of bravery, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, like the roots of the trees that surround her. And still, most people do not run. They do not scream. They do not collapse into panic. They breathe. They hold hands. They light lamps. They speak in low voices. They make choices not with certainty, but with love, with instinct, with the quiet understanding that some moments cannot be fixed, only faced. Because courage is not always in the act of leaving, nor in the act of staying, but in the space between, in the breath before the step, in the glance before the word, in the heart that beats even when it knows it may soon stop. As the last remnants of daylight dissolve into a sky that no longer resembles the heavens they have known, the people of Pompeii feel the world shift not with a sudden rupture, but with a deep, almost imperceptible change in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had grown heavier, denser, charged with a stillness that presses against the skin and makes each breath feel like an effort drawn from a well that is running dry. The coppery hue that had tinted the afternoon deepens into a bruised gray, not the soft purple of twilight, not the gentle fade of dusk, but a dense, unnatural darkness that seems to fall from above and rise from below at the same time, as if the earth and sky were closing in on the city, sealing it within a veil too thick for light to penetrate. The stars do not appear. The moon does not rise. And yet the city is not entirely dark. A faint, eerie glow lingers on the horizon, not from fire, not from lamps, but from the mountain, where a column of smoke and ash has begun to rise, so vast it looks like a tree made of shadow, its branches spreading across the sky as if claiming the night for itself, growing taller with each passing moment, silent, inevitable, unstoppable. In homes where lamps flicker with olive oil, families gather not around tables, not for meals, but near doorways, in courtyards, in the corners of rooms where the walls feel closest, as if proximity could offer protection. They do not speak much. They listen to the silence that has replaced the usual sounds of the city, to the absence of laughter in the streets, to the stillness of the dogs, to the way the sea, usually a constant murmur, has fallen quiet. A child asks why the sky looks sick, and the mother does not answer, only pulls the child closer, her hand resting on the small back, feeling the rise and fall of breath, as if memorizing it, as if storing the sensation in her bones, knowing that this warmth, this rhythm, might not last. Outside, a faint dust begins to fall, not rain, not snow, but fine gray particles that land softly on rooftops, on fountains, on the outstretched hand of a man standing in his courtyard, who watches it accumulate without moving, as if trying to understand what this quiet falling means, as if the earth itself were shedding its skin. A fisherman on the shore looks up from his boat, where he has been checking the ropes for the third time that hour, his movements slow, deliberate, as if routine could protect him from the unknown. He sees the glow on the horizon, the unnatural cloud rising from the mountain, and for a moment he thinks it is a storm, a distant fire, anything but what it is. But then he feels it, a tremor beneath his feet, deeper than before, longer, more sustained, like the earth exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. He does not run. He does not call for help. He only turns and walks back to his home, where his wife and daughter wait, and says only, "We must go." She does not ask questions. She does not beg for time. She packs a sack with bread, water, a blanket, and their child's doll, and they leave, walking not with urgency, but with the weight of knowing that time has changed its shape, that the road ahead is no longer a path through familiar fields, but a journey into a future they cannot imagine. In a house near the Forum, a man kneels beside his sleeping child, one hand resting on the boy's chest, feeling the rise and fall of breath, the warmth of skin, the way his fingers curl around the edge of the blanket as if holding on to something unseen. He had promised him they would not leave, that the house was safe, that the mountain would not wake. But now, as he watches the gray dust settle on the windowsill, as he feels the air grow thick with a scent like burnt stone, like metal left too long in a fire, he knows that love sometimes means breaking a promise. That staying may mean watching the one thing he cherishes most fade into silence. So he lifts the child gently, wraps him in a cloak, and carries him into the night, where the streets are no longer familiar, where the shadows move with a life of their own, where every step feels like a crossing from one world into another, from the known into the unknown, from the present into a memory that has not yet formed. A slave woman who had chosen to stay with the ill daughter of her master now kneels beside the girl's bed, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering that she is not alone, that she will not be left. The girl cannot walk. She cannot breathe well in the thickening air. The woman knows that to carry her may be impossible, that the road may be too far, that the dust may fall too fast. But she also knows that to abandon her would be to lose herself, that after years of living as property, this act, to stay, to care, to face the end together, is the first true choice she has ever made as a person, not as a shadow. So she lifts the girl with a strength that comes not from muscle, but from something deeper, something unnameable, and steps into the street, where the ash falls like a silent rain, covering the stones, the walls, the memories of a life that is slipping away. Her footsteps slow, her breath labored, her heart full of a quiet courage that no inscription will ever record. An elderly priest walks slowly through the forum, his steps measured, his hands resting on a wooden staff. He does not carry idols, not scrolls, not offerings. He only walks from one temple to another, touching the stone of each altar, whispering a word, a name, a breath. He does not believe the gods will save them. He does not believe in miracles, but he believes in presence, in bearing witness, in the quiet act of saying, I was here, not for glory, not for reward, but because someone must remember what this city was, not in its ruins, but in its breath, in its laughter, in the way a child once played beneath a fig tree. When he reaches the temple of Jupiter, he kneels, not in prayer, but in stillness, and waits, his face turned toward the glowing sky, as if receiving the end with the same dignity with which he lived the years before it, as if the final act of a life devoted to silence and ritual is to meet silence again, this time without words. A mother and her 2 children reach the city gate, where others are gathering, not in panic, but in a slow, uncertain movement toward the open road. The ash falls more heavily now, coating their hair, their cloaks, the edges of their sandals, turning the world into a place that feels unfamiliar, dreamlike, as if they are walking through a memory not their own. One child begins to cough, and the mother wraps a cloth around the small face, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the effort of holding on. A cart passes, overloaded with people, and someone calls for them to climb on, but there is no space. She does not beg. She does not cry. She only nods, thanks them, and continues on foot, carrying the younger child, her steps slow but steady, as if walking were the only prayer left, as if each footfall were a promise that she would not stop, not until she could go no farther. In a large house with a painted garden, the elderly man who refused to leave sits in his chair, his hands resting on the arms, his eyes fixed on the fountain where water still trickles, though more slowly than before, as if the city itself were breathing its last. The ash has begun to cover the roses, the myrtle, the frescoes on the walls, softening the colors, blurring the lines, turning beauty into something fragile, temporary. He does not move. He does not call for help. He only watches as the world outside fades, as the light disappears, as the silence grows too deep to measure. He thinks of his wife, buried beneath the tree, and whispers her name not as a play, but as a greeting, as if preparing to meet her again, as if the years between them were nothing more than a long night. And when the first wave of hot air reaches the city, he does not flinch. He closes his eyes, and in that final moment, he is not afraid, only present, as if the whole of his life had led to this quiet return. A young woman sits in her garden, writing in a small wax tablet, her stylus moving slowly across the surface, forming words that flow like water. If you are reading this, I hope you know that I loved the light in the morning, the way it touched the roses, the sound of my mother's voice calling me to dinner. I hope you know that I tried to be kind, that I watered the plants even when I was tired, that I smiled at strangers because I believed the world was good. The ash falls around her, but she does not stop. She writes until her hand can no longer move, until the air burns her lungs, until the light fades completely. And when she sets the tablet down, she does not run. She does not cry. She only looks up at the sky that is no longer a sky, and waits, not for rescue, not for answers, but for the end, as if her final act of dignity is to witness it with open eyes. A baker and his wife stand in the doorway of their home, their daughter between them, her doll clutched to her chest. They had packed a sack, checked the road, spoken of Nola, of safety, of starting again. But when the ash began to fall, when the air grew thick, when the child began to cough, they knew they could not carry her far enough. So they return inside, lock the door, light a lamp, and sit together on the floor, the three of them wrapped in a blanket, telling stories, singing songs, holding each other as the world outside dissolves into shadow. And when the darkness comes, it does not find them running. It finds them together, not in fear, but in love, not in resistance, but in surrender, as if the last gift they could give one another was the certainty of not being alone. A dog that had been untied runs through the streets, not toward the fields, not toward safety, but back to the bakery, where the oven is cold, where the last loaf of bread lies untouched on the table. It lies down beside the door, its body curled, its breath slow, as if waiting for a voice that will never call its name again, as if loyalty were not a command, but a choice made in silence, as if the last act of a life spent in chains of rope and routine was to return to the only home it had ever known, even if that home were vanishing. A fisherman and his family row across the bay, the boat moving slowly through water that ripples with an uneven rhythm, as if something beneath it is shifting, as if the sea itself were uneasy. They do not look back. They do not speak. They only row, their hands gripping the oars, their eyes fixed on the distant shore, where the glow in the sky is not a star, not a fire, but the end of a world they will carry in silence for the rest of their lives. The child sleeps in the bottom of the boat, wrapped in a blanket, unaware that behind them the city is being erased, layer by layer, by a rain that does not wash away, but covers, conceals, preserves. An old man sits on a bench in the forum, watching the shadows lengthen, then vanish. He does not move. He does not pack a bag. He only watches, as if bearing witness were the most important thing he could do, as if, by staying, he could hold the memory of this place a little longer, as if his presence, even in death, could be a kind of testimony, a quiet refusal to let the city disappear without someone knowing it had lived, had loved, had dreamed. A slave woman walks out of a house with a bundle in her arms, not stolen, but gathered, a cup, a shawl, a small statue of a goddess. She does not look back. She walks with her head high, as if for the first time she is moving toward something, not away, as if the collapse of the world had given her the only thing she had never been granted, the right to choose her own path, even if it led only a few steps before the ash covered her feet. A child lies in a cradle, wrapped in a soft woolen blanket, one tiny hand curled near their face. The mother kneels beside it, singing a lullaby in a voice so low it is almost not sound, just breath, just love, just the last thing the child will ever hear. When the air grows too thick, she lies down beside the cradle, pulls the blanket over them both, and holds her child until the silence comes. And still, the city lives, not in movement, not in sound, but in the quiet courage of those who do not run, who do not scream, who face the end not with fury, but with dignity, with love, with the simple act of being present in a world that is vanishing, as if the final truth of a life is not in how it began, but in how it ends. Because the turning point was not a single moment, not a single choice, but 1,000 small surrenders, 1,000 quiet acceptances, 1,000 breaths taken in the dark, knowing they might be the last. And in that stillness, in that surrender, there was a kind of peace, not the peace of safety, not the peace of victory, but the peace of having lived, of having loved, of having been here, now alive until the very end. As the first light of a new day fails to appear, not because time has stopped, but because the sky is no longer capable of letting light through, the city lies beneath a silence, so deep it feels like the world has forgotten how to breathe. The ash has not ceased falling. It continues to descend, soft and steady, covering rooftops, streets, fountains, gardens, turning the familiar into something dreamlike, unrecognizable, as if the earth itself were drawing a blanket over what it could no longer protect. There are no voices, no footsteps, no distant murmur of the sea. Only stillness, not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the profound hush of something that has ended, not with a scream, but with a sigh, as if the city, after living, loving, dreaming, had finally exhaled and chosen not to inhale again. And yet, in this silence, something remains. Not sound, not movement, not breath, but presence. The presence of a hand that had reached for another in the dark. The presence of a mother who sang a lullaby until her voice gave out. The presence of an old man who chose to stay with the memory of his wife beneath the myrtle tree. These are not ghosts. They are not spirits. They are not echoes in the wind. They are the weight of love that does not vanish with the body. The quiet truth that some things, a gesture, a look, a moment of courage, are not measured in time, but in depth, and depth does not erode, even under meters of ash. A child's sandal lies abandoned near the doorway of a home, small and worn at the heel, as if the foot inside had been running toward something, or away from nothing. It is not a relic. It is not an artifact. It is a reminder, not of death, but of life, of the tiny steps that once crossed this stone, of the laughter that once followed them, of the voice that called the child to dinner. To see it is to feel, not sorrow, but connection, to know that someone, long ago, was loved enough to be given a shoe, to be dressed, to be held, to be remembered even now, when no one remains to speak their name. It speaks of mornings when the sun warmed the courtyard, when the child ran to greet a parent, when the world was small and safe and full of wonder. And in that single object, buried for centuries, there is a lifetime, not of power, not of glory, but of belonging. In a bakery, the oven is cold, the last loaf of bread untouched, covered now by a thin layer of gray dust. But nearby, the dog lies curled beside the door, its body preserved not by intention, but by the very ash that took its life. It did not run. It did not flee. It returned. And in that return, there is a kind of loyalty that no command could have inspired, a bond that was not written in stone, but in the quiet rhythm of daily things. The hand that fed it, the voice that called it, the warmth of the hearth it guarded until the end. To see it is to understand that love is not only between humans, not only spoken in words, but lived in silence, in presence, in the choice to stay when there is no reason to, in the instinct that knows home, not as a place, but as a feeling, as a voice, as a hand on its back. A slave woman who carried her master's ill daughter through the falling ash now lies beside her, their bodies close, as if the final act of her life was not service, but care, not obedience, but compassion. She had no name recorded, no statue raised in her honor, no story passed down through generations. And yet, here she is, not forgotten, but found, centuries later, in the shape of two figures, preserved in the moment of their last breath. To see them is to know that dignity is not given by status, but claimed in action, that courage is not always loud, but often quiet, that the most powerful acts are those no one was meant to witness, that the truest freedom is not in running away, but in choosing to stay for someone else. An elderly priest walks slowly through the forum, his steps measured, his hands resting on a wooden staff. He does not carry idols, not scrolls, not offerings. He only walks from one temple to another, touching the stone of each altar, whispering a word, a name, a breath. He does not believe the gods will save them. He does not believe in miracles. But he believes in presence, in bearing witness, in the quiet act of saying, I was here, not for glory, not for reward, but because someone must remember what this city was, not in its ruins, but in its breath, in its laughter, in the way a child once played beneath a fig tree. When he reaches the temple of Jupiter, he kneels not in prayer, but in stillness, and waits, his face turned toward the mountain, as if receiving the end with the same dignity with which he lived the years before it, as if the final truth of a life is not in what was achieved, but in what was endured with grace. A mother and her 2 children never reach the open road. They lie together beneath the ash, the younger one in her arms, the older one close by, as if they had stopped to rest, to catch their breath, and simply did not wake again. The cloth that covered the child's face is still there, pressed against the small mouth, a final act of protection. To see them is to feel the weight of a love that did not end with life, a love that continued even when there was no hope, even when there was no future, even when all that remained was to hold on until there was nothing left to hold. She did not curse the sky. She did not scream at the mountain. She only held them, as if her arms could be a shield, as if her breath could warm them one last time, as if the world could still be made safe by the simple act of not letting go. A young woman's wax tablet is found centuries later. The style is still beside it, the words clear despite the passage of time. If you are reading this, I hope you know that I loved the light in the morning, the way it touched the roses, the sound of my mother's voice calling me to dinner. I hope you know that I tried to be kind, that I watered the plants even when I was tired, that I smiled at strangers because I believed the world was good. There is no plea for immortality, no demand to be remembered, only a quiet offering, a record of a life lived with care, with attention, with love for the small things. To read it is to receive a gift across time, a reminder that to be kind, to notice beauty, to believe in goodness, these are not small acts, but the very things that endure, not because they changed the world, but because they made one life, one day, one moment, a little softer. A fisherman and his family rowed across the bay, but the boat was never found. Perhaps they reached safety. Perhaps they did not. But the act of trying, of preparing the vessel, of holding the child close, of facing the unknown, remains. And in that there is a lesson, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. That hope is not a guarantee, but a choice, that sometimes the most important thing is not whether we survive, but how we choose to live in the moments before we don't. To leave is not always cowardice. To stay is not always bravery. But to act with love, with intention, with care, that is the only legacy that matters. A baker and his wife sit on the floor of their home, wrapped in a blanket, their daughter between them, her doll still in her hand. They did not run. They did not scream. They told stories, sang songs, held each other. And when the darkness came, they faced it together. To see them is to understand that the greatest protection is not walls, not distance, not strength, but love, not as a feeling, but as an act, repeated over and over until the end. They did not save the world. They did not escape, but they gave their child a final moment of peace, of warmth, of belonging. And in that, there is a victory, not over death, but over fear. The city is gone. The lives are ended. The homes are buried. And yet, in the silence beneath the ash, something persists, not in grand monuments, not in written histories, but in the small, quiet things. A handprint on a wall, a dog tied near a door, a letter never sent, a garden where someone once watered the plants every morning. These are not ruins. They are testaments. They are proof that to live is not to conquer, but to care, to connect, to leave behind not power, but presence. The ash covered the roofs, but not the gestures. It buried the streets, but not the love that walked them. It silenced the voices, but not the echoes of kindness that still ripple through time. And so, the loss is real. The grief is deep. The weight of what was taken, the laughter, the plans, the future that will never be, is unbearable. And yet, in that very grief, there is a lesson, that to love is to risk loss, that to live fully is to accept that it will end, and that the only way to honor what was lost is not to forget, but to remember gently, to hold the memory not with pain, but with tenderness, as one holds a child who has fallen asleep in their arms. We do not need to shout their names. We do not need to build statues. We only need to pause, to breathe, to feel the quiet truth that they were here, that they mattered, that they loved and were loved. There is no victory here, no triumph, no moral to be shouted. Only this, that in the face of the inevitable, people chose kindness. They chose to stay, they chose to care. They chose to face the end not with rage, but with dignity, not with denial, but with love. And in that there is a light, not bright, not loud, but soft, like the glow of a lamp in a window on a dark night, like the warmth of a hand in the dark, like the memory of a voice that once said your name. Because what the ash covered, it could not erase. It preserved not just bodies, but gestures, the way a man held his child, the way a woman knelt beside her friend, the way a dog waited for a voice that would never come. And in those gestures, we see not the end of a city, but the persistence of what makes us human, the need to love, to be loved, to matter, even if only to one other person. And so, the lesson is not in what was lost, but in what remained, not in the destruction, but in the details, not in the volcano, but in the hands that reached for one another in the dark. Because when everything else is stripped away, status, wealth, power, time, what is left is not fear, but connection. And connection, once made, is never truly broken. We do not remember Pompeii because of its size, or its wealth, or its gods. We remember it because, in its final moments, it showed us what we are. Fragile, yes, fleeting, yes, but also capable of great love, of quiet courage, of choosing kindness even when there is no tomorrow. It reminds us that history is not made only of emperors and battles, but of bakers and slaves, of mothers and children, of people who, in the end, simply tried to be good. And in that, there is light, not from the sun, not from fire, but from the human heart, which, even under meters of ash, continues to beat in the stories we tell, in the memories we keep, in the way we, centuries later, still whisper their names into the silence. Because loss teaches us what was precious. And what was precious was not the city, not the stone, not the wealth, but the life that moved through it, the breath that warmed it, the love that gave it meaning. And that love, though buried, is not gone. It lives in the care with which we speak of them now, in the stillness with which we listen, in the quiet tears that fall when we realize how much like them we are. And so, we do not mourn to feel pain. We remember to feel connection. We tell their story not to dwell on the end, but to honor the life that came before it, to let their quiet courage breathe in our own hearts, to carry them not as ghosts, but as guides, gentle, silent, reminding us, across the centuries, of what truly matters. Long after the ash had settled, long after the wind had stopped carrying the scent of burnt stone, long after the world had turned its attention elsewhere, the city remained, not in silence, but in stillness, buried beneath layers of earth and time, forgotten not by choice, but by the slow turning of centuries. No one walked its streets. No voice called across its courtyards. The fountains were dry. The gardens were dust. And yet, the city was not gone. It was waiting, not with hope, not with expectation, but with the quiet certainty of something preserved, not by intention, but by the very force that had taken it, as if the mountain, in its fury, had also become its guardian, sealing it in a tomb too deep for looters, too heavy for memory to reach, until the day came when someone would dig, not for gold, not for glory, but simply because the earth felt different beneath their feet, because a well was needed, because a wall was too straight to be natural, because the ground whispered, in a language only curiosity could understand, that something was there, beneath, waiting. In the early 18th century, near the coast of southern Italy, a group of laborers working on a well for a nobleman's villa felt their tools strike something hard beneath the soil. They did not know what it was. They did not imagine they were touching the edge of a world that had vanished nearly 2,000 years before. They only knew that the ground was not as it should be, too solid in places, too hollow in others, as if the earth itself were hiding something, as if the weight above it had not pressed down evenly, as if the air beneath had resisted collapse. They cleared the dirt carefully, revealing a wall painted in faded reds and yellows, the image of a man holding a cup, his face half erased by time, his hands still raised in a gesture of offering. No one celebrated, no one shouted. They covered it again, afraid of trouble, afraid of the unknown, and left it there, as if the past had asked them to wait a little longer, as if the city, sensing their fear, had chosen not to reveal itself until hands gentler than theirs would return. But the memory of that wall lingered. It passed from one worker to another, not as a story of treasure, but as a quiet wonder, of color beneath the earth, of stone that looked too perfect to be natural, of a face that had watched them, even if only for a moment. Years passed. The story was told in whispers, over meals, in taverns, to curious travelers. And in 1748, a new excavation began, not for water, not for foundations, but for what might be hidden. A team of archaeologists, funded by a curious king, arrived with brushes, trowels, and notebooks, their movements slow, deliberate, as if they were not digging, but uncovering a dream. They did not rush. They did not tear through the layers. They removed the earth grain by grain, as if afraid of breaking something too fragile to survive the light, as if the city were not a ruin, but a sleeper, and they were the first to sit beside its bed. A baker's oven was found, cold and empty, but still standing, its arch intact, as if waiting for fire. The stones had not crumbled. The hearth had not collapsed. It was as if the heat of the last loaf had not fully dissipated, as if the man who had kneaded the dough, who had wiped sweat from his brow, who had called to his apprentice, might return at any moment. A worker placed his hand on the edge of the oven, not to measure it, not to document it, but to feel its presence, to imagine the warmth that once lived there, to sense the rhythm of a life that had begun before sunrise and ended in ash. He did not speak. He only stood there, his breath slow, his mind full of a morning that had never been finished. A dog lay curled near a doorway, its body preserved in the ash, its form later filled with plaster to reveal the final moments of its life. Not in pain, not in panic, but in stillness, as if it had simply fallen asleep, waiting for a voice that would never call its name again. The workers paused when they saw it. One of them, a man from Naples, knelt and touched the ground beside it, not in reverence, but in recognition, as if he had known a dog like this once, long ago, one that waited by the door, that barked at strangers, that followed his son to school. No one spoke. They only continued, their hands now gentler, their eyes more attentive, as if they were no longer excavators, but visitors, guests in a world that had not invited them, but allowed them to enter. In a modest home, they found a small atrium where a fountain once stood, its basin cracked, its water long gone. Around it, the mosaic floor showed a dolphin leaping through waves, each tile placed with care, each curve formed by hands that had vanished centuries before. A worker brushed the dust from the image, not because it was valuable, but because it felt wrong to leave it buried, as if beauty, once made, deserved to be seen, as if the act of creating it had been a kind of prayer, and to ignore it now would be to break a promise. He did not know the name of the family who had lived there. He did not know if they had escaped or stayed. But he knew, in that moment, that they had loved beauty, that they had chosen to begin each day with the sight of water and stone and color, that they had believed in small things, in the way light fell across a courtyard, in the sound of a trickle, in the joy of a child's laugh. They entered a garden where vines once climbed the walls, where roses bloomed in spring, where a slave woman once watered the plants every morning. The plants were gone, but the shape of the garden remained, the path, the bench, the faint outline of a myrtle tree. And there, beneath the ash, they found a small clay figurine of a goddess, not broken, not lost, but placed carefully near the roots, as if someone had left it there as an offering, a prayer, a farewell. The archaeologist who found it held it in his hands for a long time, feeling its weight, its smoothness, the care with which it had been made. He did not put it in a box right away. He only looked at it, and then at the sky, as if asking, "Who were you? What did you hope for? Did you believe she heard you?" And in that silence, he realized he was not just uncovering a city, but listening to a voice that had waited 2,000 years to be heard. In a larger house, they discovered a bedroom where two figures lay close together, their bodies preserved in the ash. One was a woman, the other a young girl, too weak to walk, who had been carried to the end. The archaeologists did not speak as they worked. They poured plaster into the cavities left by the bodies, waited for it to harden, then carefully removed the ash around them. When the forms emerged, the woman's arm wrapped around the girl, her face turned toward her, her hand resting on the small shoulder. A silence fell over the sight. No camera flashed. No voice broke the quiet. They covered them again with cloth, not out of fear, but out of respect, as if they had witnessed something too sacred to be seen without humility, as if the final act of a life, to care until the end, was not a detail to be catalogued, but a truth to be honored. They found a wax tablet in a drawer, the stylus beside it, the writing still legible. If you are reading this, I hope you know that I loved the light in the morning, the way it touched the roses, the sound of my mother's voice calling me to dinner. The man who read it aloud did so in a whisper, not because he was told to, but because the words demanded it. He did not hand it to a superior. He did not write a report. He only placed it back carefully, as if the act of reading it had been a kind of intrusion, a moment of connection across time that could not be measured in data or dates, as if the woman who wrote it had not been dead, but merely sleeping, and he had woken her with his voice. A marketplace was uncovered, its stalls still standing in shadow, its counters lined with jars of oil, wine, and garum, their contents turned to dust, but their shapes intact. A child's sandal was found near a doorway, small and worn, as if the foot inside had been running. An archaeologist picked it up, not to catalogue it, but to hold it, to feel its size, to imagine the life it belonged to. He thought of his own daughter, sleeping in Naples, and for a moment the distance between past and present vanished. He did not cry. He only placed the sandal back with care, as if returning it to a sleep it had earned, as if the only way to honor it was not to take it away, but to let it rest where it had fallen, in the dust of a world that had loved it. They entered a bakery where the ovens still stood, where the millstones waited, where a donkey had once turned in slow circles. The air inside was cool, still, as if the heat of the last fire had not fully dissipated. A worker lit a lamp and placed it on a table, not because it was dark, but because the light felt like an offering, like the first warmth the room had known in centuries. No one spoke. They only stood there, feeling the presence of a life that had been lived in this place, not in grandeur, but in routine, in care, in the quiet rhythm of making bread for neighbors who would never return. And in that moment, They understood that legacy is not built in monuments, but in the small, repeated acts of nourishment, of showing up, of feeding others even when no one says thank you. In the Forum, they found the bench where an old man had sat, watching the mountain until the end. His body was not there, but the impression of his form remained in the ash. They poured the plaster, waited, uncovered it, and there he was, not in stone, not in bronze, but in the shape of absence, his hands resting on his knees, his head turned toward the sky. The archaeologist who knelt beside him did not take notes. He only whispered, "I see you," as if the act of being seen, after so long, could be a kind of return, as if the man had waited not for rescue, but for recognition, for someone to stand in that spot and say, "I know you were here. I know you stayed. I know you watched until the end." They found a dog tied near a shop, its body curled, its head down, as if waiting. They found a man clutching a small pouch of coins, not in greed, but in habit, in the instinct to hold what little he had. They found a couple embracing in a bedroom, their faces close, as if whispering a final word. They found a child's toy, a wooden horse, half buried, its paint faded, but its form still clear. And with each discovery, the team moved slower, spoke less, felt more, as if they were not uncovering a city, but remembering a person, then another, until the whole of Pompeii began to breathe again, not in flesh, but in memory, not in sound, but in the quiet presence of lives that had not asked to be gods, only to be known. Because the legacy did not begin with museums or books or tourists. It began here, in the quiet hands of those who chose to see, not just ruins, but lives. It began in the decision to pour plaster, not as a scientific technique, but as an act of return, of restoration, of saying, "You were here. We see you. We remember." It began in the silence that followed each discovery, in the breath held, in the tear wiped away, in the hand placed gently on a wall that had waited 2,000 years to be touched again, as if the only way to honor the dead was not to speak for them, but to listen. And so the city was not lost. It was only sleeping. And now, slowly, one hand at a time, it was waking. Not in noise, not in celebration, but in the quiet courage of those who knelt in the dust and said, "I am here. I see you. You are not forgotten." And in that moment, Pompeii ceased to be a ruin and became a story, not of destruction, but of return, of memory, of love that had survived even the weight of the mountain. Because legacy is not built in monuments, but in moments, in the choice to look closely, to feel deeply, to honor what was small, what was human, what was real. And in that choice, Pompeii began to live again, not as it was, but as it is remembered, not in stone, but in the quiet courage of those who dared to see it, and to say softly, across the centuries, "I am here. I see you. You are not forgotten." And so, the first hands to remember were not those of kings or scholars, but of workers, of curious men, of quiet women who brushed dust from a face and felt, not triumph, but kinship. They did not conquer the past. They joined it. And in that joining, they gave the city a new kind of life, not in breath, but in breathlessness, not in movement, but in the stillness of being seen at last. Because to be remembered is not to be resurrected, but to be witnessed. And to be witnessed, after so long, is the gentlest form of return. Long after the first hands had brushed the dust from the walls, long after the plaster had hardened into the shapes of those who had vanished, long after the world had begun to speak of Pompeii as a city found, the memory of it did not settle into books or museums alone, but into the quiet spaces between breaths, into the way a visitor might pause on a sunlit street and feel, not curiosity, not history, but kinship. The city was no longer buried, but it was not fully unearthed either. It existed now in a space between worlds, not quite past, not quite present, but somewhere in the soft edges of dreaming, where time does not march forward, but gathers slowly, like mist over a garden at dawn, like the warmth that remains in a chair after someone has risen, like the echo of a voice that never truly fades, but waits in the silence for someone to listen. Generations passed, not in the rush of progress, but in the quiet accumulation of moments. Children who heard stories from their parents, parents who walked the same paths their grandparents had described, not from maps, but from letters, from dreams, from a feeling too deep to name. A young woman from Spain arrived one morning, not with a guidebook, but with a letter she had written to a friend, in which she said she wanted to stand where someone had once loved enough to paint a dolphin on their floor, to plant roses in a courtyard, to write a note that said, "Have a good day." She did not know whose hand had made those things. She only knew that they had been made with care, and that care, once given, does not disappear, even when the hands that gave it are gone. She knelt beside a mosaic, not to touch it, but to be near it, to feel the presence of the person who had chosen each tile, who had spent hours arranging color and shape, not for glory, but for beauty, for the joy of a child who might run across it barefoot, for the pleasure of a guest who would admire it while sipping wine. And in that moment, she understood that memory is not built in monuments, but in the small, repeated acts of love, in the way a person might choose to make their world more beautiful, not because it would last, but because it mattered. A man from a city of steel and glass walked through the forum, his steps slow, his eyes not on the ruins, but on the mosaic beneath his feet, where thousands of tiny stones formed the image of a dog with a collar, and the words Cave Canem written in red tile. He did not laugh at the ancient warming. He knelt, not to touch it, but to be closer, to feel the presence of the person who had chosen to place it there, perhaps as a joke, perhaps as protection, perhaps simply because it felt right to mark the threshold of a home. He thought of his own apartment, of the keys he left by the door, of the way he said, "Welcome," to guests, not with a sign, but with a gesture. And in that moment, he understood that some things are not built to last. They are built to mean, and meaning, once planted, grows even in ash, even in silence, even in the absence of those who made it. A child ran through the streets, not in silence, but in laughter, her voice echoing between the high walls, and for a moment the archaeologists paused, not in annoyance, but in recognition, because the sound was not so different from the ones that had lived here long ago, because joy, like grief, does not change with time, because the echo of a child's laugh is the same whether it comes from sandals on stone or sneakers on pavement. Her mother called her gently, not to scold, but to point to a small garden where a fountain once stood, and together they imagined the water, the shade, the hand that had once placed a cup there, perhaps for a guest, perhaps for a lover, perhaps just for themselves on a hot afternoon. The child did not ask many questions. She only listened, and later, at home, she drew a picture of a woman watering roses, not because she was told to, but because the feeling had stayed with her, like a scent on the skin, like a melody half remembered. A painter sat in a quiet corner, not copying the frescoes, not reproducing them for sale, but sketching the way the light fell across a wall at midday, how it touched the edge of a broken column, how it lingered in the cracks. He did not speak to anyone. He only drew slowly, as if the act of seeing was a kind of prayer. When someone asked what he was capturing, he said, not the city, the silence between its breaths. And in that silence, he found not emptiness, but presence, the weight of 1,000 mornings that had begun with sunlight on stone, with the smell of bread, with the sound of a door opening, with the quiet rhythm of a life that believed in tomorrow. He did not finish the drawing. He only closed his notebook and walked away, knowing that some moments are not meant to be kept, but to be lived and remembered in the body, not on paper. A poet from a distant country walked through the house of the tragic couple, where two figures lay preserved in plaster, their arms wrapped around each other, their faces close, as if whispering a final word. He did not take a photo. He did not write a line. He only stood there, his hands at his sides, his breath slow, until tears came, not from sadness, but from the certainty that love, even when it cannot save, is never wasted. He thought of his own life, of the people he had loved, of the moments he had not held long enough, of the words he had left unsaid. And later, in a notebook, he wrote a single sentence: "To stay is not always to survive. Sometimes it is to love until the air runs out." He did not publish it. He only read it once, then closed the book, knowing that some truths are not for the world, but for the heart. A student of history walked the streets with a notebook, not to record measurements, not to memorize dates, but to imagine the lives that had moved through this place, the baker who rose before dawn, the slave who swept the mosaics, the child who played with a wooden horse. She stopped at a small shop where jars of oil and wine had been found, still lined up as if waiting for customers. And for a long time, she simply looked not at the artifacts, but at the space between them, at the air that had once carried voices, laughter, the clink of a cup. And she realized that to study history is not to collect facts, but to practice empathy, to enter a world that is gone and say, "I see you. I know you are here." And in that act of seeing, she felt not distance, but connection, not time, but presence. An old man from Naples came every year, not because he was a scholar, not because he had family here, but because his grandfather had worked on the early excavations, and had once told him, in a quiet voice, that he had touched the hand of a woman who had died holding her child, and that he had never forgotten the warmth that still seemed to linger in the plaster. The old man did not speak of ghosts. He spoke of memory, of how some places hold the shape of what lived in them, of how grief, when tended, becomes love, and love, when remembered, becomes legacy. He did not stay long. He only walked the same path his grandfather had described, touched the same wall, sat on the same bench, and whispered, "I'm here," not to the city, but to the man who had passed the memory down, as if to say, "I carry it now. I will not let it go." A woman knelt beside the impression of the dog near the bakery, not to mourn, but to leave a small piece of bread on the stone, not as a ritual, but as a gesture, as if to say, "You waited. You stayed. Someone should feed you now." No one saw her. She did not care. She only placed it there, then rose and walked away, her shadow stretching behind her like a quiet companion. Later, someone else saw the bread, did not remove it, but left a small flower beside it, not knowing why, only feeling that something sacred had happened there, not in the past, but in the present. A teacher brought her class from a small town in France, not to test them, not to assign grades, but to let them feel the weight of a moment that had lasted 2,000 years. She did not lecture. She only asked them to sit in the atrium of a home, to close their eyes, and to imagine the sounds that had once filled it, the trickle of water, the murmur of voices, the footsteps of someone walking to the kitchen. When they opened their eyes, one child said, "I heard someone humming." The teacher did not correct her. She only smiled, because she knew that memory is not always in the mind, but in the body, in the way a place can speak without words, in the way a child can hear what an adult has forgotten how to listen for. A writer sat on a bench in the forum, not writing, not thinking, just breathing. He had come because he was tired of noise, tired of screens, tired of the constant rush of the present. And here, in this city that had stopped breathing, he found the quiet he had been searching for. He did not stay long. He only sat, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed, until he felt not sadness, not awe, but peace, the peace of being in a place where time had paused, where nothing was demanded, where simply being was enough. And when he rose to leave, he did not look back. He only carried the stillness with him, like a secret, like a gift. A mother walked with her daughter, a girl no older than 7, who asked why the houses had no roofs, why the streets were cracked, why the people were gone. The mother did not give a long answer. She only said, "Because sometimes the world changes in a moment, but love doesn't." The child did not speak again. She only held her mother's hand tighter, and for the rest of the visit she looked not at the ruins, but at the hands of the people around her, as if memorizing the way they held each other, as if understanding that the real city was not in the stones, but in the gestures. A musician sat in a courtyard and played a single note on a flute, not for an audience, not for recording, but to see if the air would carry it the way it once had. The sound echoed softly, then faded. He played it again and again, and each time it felt less like an experiment and more like a conversation, not with the dead, but with the silence they had left behind, with the memory of music that had once danced through these walls, that had accompanied laughter, that had filled the space between words. And when he stopped, the silence felt different, not empty, but full, as if the city had exhaled in response. A couple stood in a bedroom where 2 figures had been found embracing, their faces close, their arms wrapped around each other. They did not speak. They only held hands, and for a long time they looked at the plaster forms, not as strangers, but as witnesses. And when they turned to leave, one of them whispered, "We'll remember them," not as a promise, but as a fact, as if love, once seen, cannot be unremembered, as if the act of witnessing is itself a kind of immortality. A historian who had spent decades studying Pompeii returned for the last time, not to write a book, not to give a lecture, but to sit in the garden of a large house, where roses once bloomed, where a slave woman had once watered the plants every morning. He did not take notes. He did not speak. He only sat, his back against a wall, his eyes closed, until the sun moved across the sky and the shadows shifted over the stones. And in that stillness he understood that history is not in the facts, but in the feeling, in the way a place can hold the echo of a life, in the way a gesture can survive 2,000 years, in the way a single act of kindness can become a light that never goes out. A child left a small drawing on a bench, a sun, a house, 2 figures holding hands. No one knew who made it. No one removed it. It stayed there for days, until the wind took it, not as loss, but as offering, as if the child had given back what the city had given them, the certainty that they mattered, that they were seen, that they were part of something larger, that even the smallest things can become memory. And so time gathered around the memory, not in monuments, not in textbooks, but in quiet moments like these, in a tear, in a breath, in a hand placed gently on a wall, in a story told at night, in a letter written to no one. The city was not rebuilt. It was not restored. But it was remembered, not as a tragedy, not as a ruin, but as a testament to life, to love, to the quiet courage of those who lived, who loved, who were here. Because to remember is not to bring back. It is to say, across the silence of centuries, I am here. I see you. You are not forgotten. And in that act, the past does not die. It breathes softly in the hearts of those who listen. And in that breath, in that whisper, in that quiet recognition, Pompeii did not return to life. It never stopped living. Long after the last visitor has left the ruins, long after the gates have closed and the lights have dimmed, long after the world has turned its attention to other stories, other cities, other dreams, Pompeii does not fall silent. It does not return to stillness as it once was, but to a different kind of quiet, not the silence of absence, but of presence, not the hush of death, but of memory breathing softly beneath the stone. The wind moves through the empty courtyards, not with force, but with care, brushing against walls painted with images of gods and gardens, carrying with it the faintest echo of a child's laugh, a murmur of a prayer, a creak of a door that once opened to welcome someone home. And in that wind, in that breath of air across 2,000 years, there is a whisper, not loud, not urgent, but persistent, like the rhythm of a heart that never stopped beating, like the warmth of a hand that once touched another and left behind not just a memory, but a feeling that still lingers in the air, waiting to be felt by someone who knows how to be still. A man in a city far away, lying awake in the dark, dreams of a street paved with worn stone, of a fountain that trickles in a garden he has never seen, of a handprint pressed into wet plaster long before his birth. He does not know why he sees it. He does not try to explain it. But when he wakes, he feels a strange sense of calm, as if the dream was not his, but a gift, a moment of peace passed from one life to another, across the vast silence of time. He thinks of the baker who rose before dawn, of the mother who combed her child's hair, of the slave who swept the same path every morning, not for glory, but for order, for dignity, for the quiet certainty that small things matter. And though he will never visit Pompeii, he carries it within him, not as history, but as a feeling, like the warmth of sunlight on skin, like the comfort of a voice that once called a name now forgotten, like the knowledge that to live is not to conquer, but to care, to be present, to leave behind not power, but presence. A child draws a picture in school, a house with a red roof, a woman watering roses, a dog curled by the door. The teacher asks where the idea came from, and the child says, "I saw it in a dream." No one questions it. No one needs to. Because some memories are not learned. They are remembered. And perhaps, somewhere in the blood, in the breath, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, we all carry the echo of lives that came before, not as facts, but as feelings, not as stories, but as sensations. The weight of a hand in yours, the scent of bread in the morning, the sound of water in a fountain on a hot day. The child does not know of the mountain, of the ash, of the end. But she draws the garden, not because it was beautiful, but because it felt right, as if her hand were guided by something older than memory, something that knows that beauty, once made, does not vanish, even when the world does. A woman walks through the ruins, not for the first time, but for the 10th, the 20th, as if returning to a place she once lived. She does not speak. She does not take photos. She only walks the same path, touches the same wall, sits on the same bench where an old man once watched the mountain until the end. And each time, she feels not sadness, but connection, as if she is not visiting the past, but rejoining it, as if her presence, her breath, her stillness, is a kind of reply to a question asked long ago, will anyone remember us? And by returning, by being there, by not looking away, she answers, yes, I am here. I see you. You are not forgotten. She does not need to shout it. She does not need to write it down. She only needs to be present, to let the silence speak, to let the city know that it is still seen, still felt, still loved. A father tells his daughter a story at bedtime, not of heroes or monsters, but of a city that was buried by ash, of people who loved, who cooked meals, who watered plants, who wrote notes to each other, who believed in tomorrow. The child listens, her eyes heavy, her breath slow. She does not ask if it's true. She only says, did they know they would be remembered? The father does not know how to answer. He only says, I think they hoped so. And in that moment, the story is no longer about the past. It is about now. It is about the act of telling, of listening, of passing on, not just facts, but feeling, of making sure that what was small, what was human, what was real, does not vanish. Because every time a story is told, it is not just remembered. It is reborn, not in stone, but in breath, not in words, but in the warmth of a voice in the dark. A scientist who has studied the eruption, who has analyzed the layers of ash, who has mapped the pyroclastic flows, stands at the edge of the city one evening, long after work has ended. He does not speak of data. He does not write notes. He only looks at the mountain, still green, still quiet, still watching. And for the first time, he does not see a geological event. He sees a moment, a breath held, a life interrupted, a love preserved. He thinks of the plaster casts, of the woman holding her child, of the dog curled by the door, of the couple embracing in their final hours. And he realizes that what he has studied is not just a disaster, but a testament to what it means to be alive, to care, to believe in the ordinary, even when the world is about to end. And in that realization, he feels not triumph, but humility, not knowledge, but kinship, not distance, but belonging. A poet sits by a window in winter, rain tapping gently on the glass, and writes a single line. They did not know they were becoming a dream. She does not publish it. She does not show it to anyone. She only reads it once, then closes the notebook, knowing that some truths are not for the world, but for the heart. And in that line, she holds the essence of Pompeii, not as a ruin, not as a lesson, but as a lullaby sung across centuries. A reminder that to live is to leave behind not power, not glory, not wealth, but moments, a hand in yours, a meal shared, a garden watered, a note that says, "Have a good day." These are not grand gestures. They are quiet ones. And yet, they are the only things that survive. A teacher shows her students a photograph of the plaster cast of a woman holding her child, their faces close, their bodies preserved in the ash. She does not speak of death. She speaks of love. She says, they chose to stay together. And in that choice, in that final act of care, the children understand something deeper than history. They understand connection. They understand courage. They understand that the most powerful things in life are not loud, but quiet, not grand, but small, not lasting forever, but lasting long enough to matter. One child asks, "Would you do the same?" The teacher does not answer. She only holds her hand over her heart, and the child understands. Yes, a man in a hospital room, holding the hand of someone he loves, thinks of the couple found embracing in a bedroom in Pompeii, their arms wrapped around each other, their faces close, as if whispering a final word. He does not cry. He only holds on tighter, because in that ancient gesture, he finds comfort, the certainty that love does not end when the world does. That to stay, to hold on, to be present, is the most sacred act of all. He does not need to speak. He does not need to explain. He only needs to be there, to let his presence say what words cannot. I am with you. I will not leave. A woman leaves a flower on a stone in the garden where a slave once watered the plants every morning. She does not know the woman's name. She does not know her story. But she leaves it anyway, not as a ritual, but as a gesture, as if to say, I see your care. I honor your hands. I remember you. And in that act, the past does not feel distant. It feels close, alive, breathing in the present. She does not need to know everything. She only needs to feel enough to respond, to let the echo become a conversation, to let the silence be filled with something as simple as a flower, as powerful as remembrance. A child, lying in bed, asks their mother, "Do people who lived long ago still exist?" The mother does not say they are gone. She says, they live in the things they loved, in the people who remember them, in the way we still walk the same streets, feel the same sun, love the same way. And the child closes their eyes, not afraid, but peaceful, because they understand that to be remembered is a kind of return, that to be loved is to never truly disappear. And in that understanding, the child feels not loss, but connection, not distance, but belonging. And so the echoes do not fade. They gather, they grow. They move through the world in quiet ways, in a story told at night, in a tear shed for strangers, in a hand placed gently on a wall, in a dream that feels too real to be imagination. Pompeii is not a city of the past. It is a presence in the present. Not in stone, not in plaster, but in the way we choose to remember, to care, to notice the small things, to believe that a life lived with kindness is never lost. It lives in the way we love, in the way we grieve, in the way we choose to see beauty, even when the world is heavy. Because what remains is not what was built, but what was felt. Not the size of the homes, but the warmth inside them. Not the height of the walls, but the love that moved through them. Not the power of an empire, but the breath of a child, the touch of a hand, the light of a lamp in a window on a dark night. And in that, there is a question, soft and gentle, that drifts through the air like ash, carried on a breeze. What will you leave behind? Not in wealth, not in name, not in stone, but in feeling. In the way someone remembers your voice, your hands, your presence. In the quiet courage of being kind, of staying, of loving, even when you know it may not last. Because the city did not survive, but it did not vanish. It became something else, not a ruin, not a lesson, not a warning, but a whisper, carried through time, not in words, but in feeling, in memory, in the way we, centuries later, still pause, still listen, still say softly, to no one and to everyone, I see you, I remember you, you are not forgotten. And in that whisper, we find not sorrow, but continuity, not end, but return. And so, the echoes still whisper, not from the mountain, not from the ash, but from within us, in the way we love, in the way we care, in the way we choose to remember those who came before, not with sorrow, but with tenderness, not with distance, but with kinship, because to remember is not to bring back. It is to say, across the silence of centuries, you mattered, you were here, and because of that, you still are. And in that whisper, in that breath, in that quiet recognition, Pompeii does not return to life. It never stopped living. It lives in the child who draws a garden, in the mother who tells a story, in the stranger who leaves a flower, in the silence between heartbeats, in the way we even now, even here, still choose to be kind, to be present, to love, even when we know it may not last. Because to live is to leave behind not monuments, but moments. And moments, when remembered, become eternal. And so, the story drifts to a close, not with a final word, but with a quiet breath, like the last ripple in a fountain after the water has stilled. You've walked through the streets of Pompeii, not as a visitor, not as a historian, but as a quiet witness to lives lived, to love given, to moments preserved not in stone, but in memory. You felt the warmth of the morning sun on ancient stone, the hush before the mountain stirred, the weight of a hand that reached for another in the dark. And now, as the echoes of that city fade into the night, you can let go, not of what you've heard, but of the need to hold it tightly, as if it could vanish. Let the ash settle in your mind. Let the images soften, like a dream upon waking. Let the voices, the baker calling to his apprentice, the child laughing in the courtyard, the woman whispering to her daughter, drift gently into silence, not lost, but resting, like embers in a hearth that still holds warmth. You don't need to remember every word, every name, every stone. You only need to carry the feeling, the quiet truth that to live is not to be grand, but to be present, not to be remembered, but to love. If this story found its way into your heart, wherever you are listening from, beneath soft blankets, in a room lit by the glow of a screen, in the quiet hours before sleep, thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening, for breathing with this story as it unfolded across centuries. This space, this moment, is made possible by listeners like you, who choose slowness in a world that rushes, who choose stillness when everything demands noise. If you'd like to stay, to walk through other cities that dream beneath time, you're always welcome here. There are many more stories waiting, not to teach, but to whisper, not to inform, but to accompany. But for now, let yourself rest. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink into stillness. And if you'd like, imagine for a moment that you're standing in a garden in Pompeii, just after dawn. The roses are in bloom. The fountain trickles softly. A breeze moves through the vines. And somewhere, just out of sight, a woman hums as she waters the plants, not knowing she will be remembered, not knowing her care will echo 2,000 years later in the heart of someone lying awake, listening, and finally, letting go. Sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle.